thank you. I'm going to talk slightly from a different perspective. My name is Hossein Alizadeh, for those of you who came late. I work for the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission. And the special region that I work on is Middle East and North Africa. So I'm going to primarily talk about the right of the sexual minorities, lesbian, transgender, gay, and lesbians in the Middle East and North Africa. And the region is primarily a Muslim region. Most of the populations are Muslim. So I'm just going to talk about the social, religious, and cultural problems that stems from. I'm sorry, I was told that my voice is not strong enough, so please let me know in the back, especially if you have difficulty understanding me. I want to start by saying that there is a big difference between what other speakers described here in terms of the Catholic Church and also and what we have in the Muslim world. Basically, in the Catholic Church, you have a very centralized structure. And as such, when something happens, the entire structure has to deal with it, and there are doctrines and procedures that basically is decided by the entire system. It is not the same when we talk about the Muslim clergies. Basically, you have a very decentralized system. In every country and every culture, it has its own flavor. So what we have is that you have social, cultural, and political and legal, basically, battles that is being fought in every country, different from others. There are four major school of thoughts among Sunni Muslims, and then you have the Shiite Muslims that they have their own structure. Theirs is slightly similar to the Catholic Church in the sense that it is more centralized. Still, they don't have the Pope, but they have a structure that you have sort of like the cardinals, that is, they call them ayatollahs. So in that system, it is slightly different because when you have a doctrine that it needs to be debated among all the ayatollahs, regardless of where they are from and how they basically think, they have to come together and make a consensus about how to proceed about different issues. What we have been witnessing in the Middle East and North Africa is that, unfortunately, the majority of anti-LGBT violence has been either condoned or actively executed by religious forces. You have cases like Morocco where you have Islamist parties that they often talk about basically homosexuality as a form of perversion. So they basically encourage people to take action. You have cases like Iraq where the religious leaders instigate basically violence, actively speaking in the mosques and inviting their followers to commit acts of violence against homosexuals. And then you have countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran where practically the religious leaders execute basically members of the LGBT community, and they are very proud of that. Just yesterday, I was reading a newspaper editorial in Tehran. It was a response, sort of a response to the latest report by the UN Special Rapporteur on human rights situation in Iran, where he basically documented cases of violence against LGBT people. And the editorial very clearly said that we violate LGBT rights and we are very proud of it. We want you to know, and we want the international community to know that this is in accordance with our belief and our principle. And not only we do that, we would like this happens in other countries as well. And then they go on arguing about why they don't think that LGBT rights is not part of human rights, basically. So this is the kind of conceptual framework that we're dealing with. And what I have noticed is that in most cases, even in countries where you have sodomy laws, countries where you have active punishment for people who are engaged in same-sex practices, the majority of cases of violence comes from society and family members. And to me, at the beginning, it was a little bit surprising when we did some research in certain countries, and we realized that the fact is that the family members, the society, basically are inspired by the religious, basically, dialogue and discourse, and that's where they get their education, sexual education, their understanding of the proper sexual behavior. And so when they realize that one of their family members are gay or lesbian, so they basically try to protect their honors. And this is a big concept. In most cases, even in a country like Iraq, where we have seen waves of violence against LGBT people, people are killed, and the family members don't even bother to report those cases to the police or officials. And when reported, the police turn the other way around and basically say that, well, it's a family affair, we really don't want to intervene. The issue here is the religious dogma that exists, in my opinion. When part of the problem, and this is especially true in Middle Eastern languages, in Persian and also in Arabic, when you talk about homosexuality and same-sex practices, often people don't have a clear understanding of what you're talking about. So I've seen major newspapers translating homosexuality as pedophilia, or basically sex work or prostitution. So they just assume that one is the other and there is not really a big difference. And I think that part of the misunderstanding is that there is a lack of clear understanding of what exactly it means to talk about sexual identity and gender identity and sexual orientation. And so in my opinion, part of the solution to solve this issue is to start an educational campaign in the region to talk about basically sexual orientation and gender identity. And the other part is about the gender roles and equality between men and women. I feel that that is also very clear, even when you look at court cases in countries where homosexuality is illegal. You often see the majority of people who are being tried are men, and also the level of punishment for men and women are very different. So I'll just give you the example of Iran, where if two men are caught having sex with each other for the first time, the punishment is death. For two lesbians, on the other hand, for the first 3 times there's 100 lashes, and then there is death penalty. Now, that doesn't make it better, but it all shows that there is a different level of understanding of the same-sex practices between men and women. And I feel that part of that also goes back to the social, basically, lack of social dialogue about sexuality in general. I feel that when we talk about sexual rights, people don't fully understand or appreciate in many societies what exactly is being discussed. Often they think that there is a desire to promote sexual perversion or basically absolute sexual freedom that requires people to involve in orgies, basically. So there is no clear understanding of that, and I feel that whenever there is a push for that kind of dialogue, there has been some sort of positive feedback from the religious leaders and community members. One of the examples is in Egypt. There has been some sort of dialogue in Egypt that stopped after the Arab Spring. The UNDP started an annual dialogue between religious leaders and community leaders about HIV/AIDS, and then through that forum they start discussing sexual orientation and gender identity. It was a very difficult conversation because, as I said in the beginning, there was a great deal of misunderstanding about what exactly that means. And what I heard is that towards the end, after 2 or 3 years, basically that dialogue became more constructive because people start to understand what the other side are talking about and what basically the concerns of the other party is. One thing I want to be very clear about is that the notion of sexuality is very different in Islam compared to Christianity. In Christianity, you can only have sex for reproduction, at least that's the theory in Catholic Church, for example. Not so in Islam. You can have sex for pleasure. It is a very well-accepted principle, and there's nothing wrong with that. So the fact that sexuality is being perceived differently shows that there is also room for negotiation of the roles of both gender and also sexuality. I remember when I was a kid, I was reading a book by a very prominent Shiite theologian. He was assassinated in 1980s because of his political involvement. The name of the book was Islam and the question of hijab. And one thing that he mentioned very clearly, and I still remember that, is about the issue of sexual relationship between men and women. And he argued that unlike what we were told really, the sexuality of women was not restricted in early days of Islam. And he mentions that in the early days of Islam, there was a practice among the people of Saudi Arabia, today's Saudi Arabia, where women were allowed to have male servants who offered them sexual pleasure, basically, and you could have as many of them as you wanted, and that was within the framework of Islam. And he argues that something happened throughout centuries that made the Islamic societies more conservative about their thinking of sexuality and also about the role of women specifically. The issue of headscarf was one of them, perhaps. But what I'm trying to say is that when we talk about religious violence, a lot of that has to do with also cultural understanding of sexuality and gender. When you have a more open society, the approach of the society starts to change about sexuality, and as a result of that, the religious leaders often respond positively and allow people to renegotiate their sexuality and their sexual roles in the society. The example that I want to give you is Afghanistan. Compare Afghanistan with a country like Iran or with a country like Egypt. So in Afghanistan, when Taliban came to power, they tried to impose their version of Islam, but the truth is, in most cases, what they imposed was a very traditional understanding of the roles of women, especially. And that was challenged by other religious leaders in other countries because they said, wait a minute, but this is not what the text says. This is not what basically we understand from Islam. And so that is an important point for us to understand, that everything is local, as they say. If we move from one country to the other, we see a very different dynamics between genders and members of the basically community. And so what I hope happens is that as we move forward to a more global community and we move forward towards having a more open dialogue about sexuality and gender, the understanding of society also changes, and as a result, it pushes the religious community to be more open about their understandings of sexuality. One last thing I want to mention is also the role of religious fundamentalism in the West and how that also has an impact on Muslim communities. To me, it's very interesting. A lot of groups that Reverend Ackerman mentioned earlier today that are very actively involved at the UN level, basically challenging the progressive movement of feminists. Their work has been translated and used in many languages, including in Arabic and Persian and Turkish, in a way that even sounds ridiculous to me, because the frameworks are very different. Because they are very well organized and they basically are very articulate, whatever they say is easily available in other countries, and so it's the easiest thing for local communities that oppose basically feminist movement or LGBT movement is that to translate them and then publish in their own language. Just one example to demonstrate the issue. Last year, it was in February, I was in Turkey, and I noticed that the Prime Minister of Turkey had a speech about abortion. And what he said is that it's time for Turkey to basically pass legislations to ban abortion. And then he continued talking about how abortion should be illegal and women should not, basically involved in abortion. But what is so interesting to me is the issue of ensoulment in Islam and the difference between Christianity and Islam. For the Christian community, the moment that the fetus is perceived, there is no really challenge about it. You have a human being, and as a result of that, there is no, but it is considered abortion. Not so in Islam. Different schools of thought exist, but there are some scholars that argue that for the first 3 months of pregnancy, you're not really dealing with a human being. So you can end your pregnancy without calling it an abortion. So when I heard that speech, I was like, well, so somebody translated some pamphlets from English and then put it in front of the Turkish Prime Minister and asked him to read it, for the audience in Turkey, without really thinking through that there is a big doctrinal difference in terms of what the Christian thinks of abortion and what the Muslims thinks of abortion. So, as Reverend Patty Ackerman mentioned, the impact of religious fundamentalism in the United States is being felt even in non-Christian societies in a way that surprises the local population. And one last thing is that often what I see here as being promoted as this attack against progressive movement of feminists and sometimes of the Western governments promoting that agenda is being translated in the Middle East and North Africa and then being promoted as anti-American, anti-Western sentiment. So in a strange way, the conservative movement in this country, the fundamentalist movement in this country is providing free ammunition to anti-American sentiments in other countries, because many of those people translate it and say, see, this is what the West is doing to us. See, this is what the United States is trying to promote in our society, without really understanding the complexity of the situation. I stop here, and hopefully we can have more conversation around this during the question and answers. Thank you.